Where to, where do I go? If you never try, then you'll never know. How long do I have to climb up on the side of this mountain of mine? All right, howdy hags. Welcome back to Biomechanics. Today we're going to be finishing up talking about Newton's laws and applications. We're on Newton's second law, which of course is the law of acceleration. Then we're going to get to the law of action and reaction. So at the speed of sound, if you remember our discussion about the whip and the kinematic chain, the speed of sound is roughly about, at least at sea level, about 767 miles an hour at one Earth's atmosphere. And so that's kind of the effect of a plane or an object traveling that fast. And if you remember, the end of the whip actually breaks the sound barrier very briefly. Even the Mythbusters back in the day couldn't bust it. They figured, though, that the whip actually reached the speed in less than 1/10,000th of a second. So it happens really fast. But the snap that you hear is actually the shock wave of the end of the whip actually breaking the sound barrier. It's one of the reasons you don't want to get near the end of a whip if it's going that fast. So we were talking about the conservation of angular momentum, and I was actually kind of tying this into film analysis. And even though Etienne Jules Murray, who published a very famous paper in Nature in 1894 about how a cat can always upright itself and land on its feet if it's dropped or thrown or falls out of a tree, etc. How does that instinct work? How does it not defy the laws of physics? It seems like it does, but we're going to talk about how that works using the conservation of angular momentum. And that means that the angular momentum in a system, unless there's an outside force acting on it, doesn't change. Now, this gets complicated because gravity is acting on the cat the entire time, but we'll show you how this works. It's really pretty cool. So here's the notion. Remember, angular momentum is the product of moment of inertia times angular velocity. So if we can manipulate the moment of inertia, we can affect the angular velocity or the spinning rate. But it means if part of the body rotates in one direction, another part of the body has to rotate in the other direction. And here's where it gets actually a little bit tricky. And I've been looking at this, and I'm going to slightly deviate from Dr. Murray's original explanation. And I think it comes down to, even though the cat looks like it has two axes of rotation at the same time, I'm going to show you that there's one main axis that it focuses on, and then it does a switcheroo. It changes the axis of rotation. In both cases, it's going to maintain the overall angular momentum of the system, and they end up landing on their feet. One of the things I didn't know until I looked at some film and some analysis is they land with their claws out. So that way, as soon as they land, they dig into the ground, they can take off. Because that's usually what happens. Cat lands and then boom, it's out of there. So no flies on the cat for sure. What seems to happen is the cat, let's say, is in a tree and falls out of a tree for whatever reason. The fireman didn't get up there in time. You've heard the story about firemen. So the cat does something interesting. It's going to flex its spine and create an axis of rotation. And it does it really quickly. And this is the first thing that it does. Trixie behind me is taking some notes. So Trixie has a friend, Sheldon. Sheldon's an orange tabby. Unfortunately, Trixie likes to chase Sheldon quite a bit and sometimes causes a ruckus. They do kind of like each other, but it's one of those interesting relationships. We had a Labrador before. In fact, they were both around together, but unfortunately, her sister Daisy passed away not long ago, and we had another orange tabby back in the day. But Baxter, and Baxter thought it was a dog. It was raised by wolves, raised by raised by dogs on a farm, and so the cat always thought it was a dog. So Daisy and Baxter always got along, didn't chase each other, hung out with pals, etc., slept together. I know it was like end of the world type stuff. But Sheldon and Trixie have a more stereotypical cat-dog relationship, so got to watch out at all times. So if it's Sheldon or Baxter, any type of cat, even one that thinks it's a dog, first thing it's going to do, it's going to, and we don't want to use the term bend necessarily, even though it kind of looks like a bend, it's going to flex its spine. And so it has this axis right here. That's going to be up the chest, torso, and head. And what the cat's going to do, it's going to rotate the upper part of the body really quickly. It's going to bring its, forelegs, arms, if you will, forelegs in, and then rotate really quickly. By bringing the arms in, that reduces the moment of inertia around that axis of rotation, and it's going to turn fast so that the eyes are starting to face the ground and it's getting its orientation. It has a little gyroscope in its inner ear that tells it whether it's upright or not. I hate to say, they tried cats in space, and they weren't really happy about not knowing where the ground was. So anyway, we'll go into any more of that. So because the upper body is rotating in one direction, that means the rest of the body has to rotate in the other direction. But here's what gets confusing. You could think of this as another axis, and you could think about this rotating in the opposite direction, but it's really at almost a 90-degree angle. So I don't think it's really what happens. What appears to happen is the overall mass of that lower half shifts kind of upwards. Imagine we have some clockwise rotation of the whole thing. It's not rotating like that, it's rotating like this. So if you want to think about this, where I'm pointing is a plane, it's going to rotate. So all you have to do is move some mass in that direction. So what the cat does is it moves the tail in that direction, so it's counter to the rotation by the upper part of the body. And then the back leg goes up like this, which moves some mass in the opposite direction as the forelimbs and the head and the upper part of the body. But it also increases the moment of inertia. So the point is, you don't have to move a lot here to actually counter that upper body and head movement. Okay, so now the cat has one, and it takes that foreleg or the downward leg, brings it in and points it downward. So it's got one paw downward, two more paws downward, and the face downward. Okay, so what's the trick from here? Well, as it finishes rotating the upper part of the body, that, and again, I hate to use the term bend in the spine, but that flexion, it's really technically hyperextension. Hyperextension, flex of the spine, if you will. That's going to create a new axis of rotation. So here's what they do from there. The cat is going to now rotate the upper part of the body in one direction. As we're looking at it, we're going to say that's clockwise, and the lower half in the other part of the body. So one of the tricks that it's doing is actually continuing to swing the tail so that it's counter to the movement of the upper body. And then as it does that, as you go from this hyperextended position to a normal position, it has to, in a sense, flex the torso. And that means it's like the same kind of movement you would do with a sit-up. It means you usually bring the hips in and you contract the rectus abdominis to straighten out the spine and produce flexion. Does that make sense? So now the two legs come in, the tail has been kind of a counterbalance, and now all four legs are facing the ground. So bringing that mass downward in the clockwise direction to counteract the effect of the upper body rotating in the other direction, and that's going to be accomplished by contracting the rectus abdominis and a few other muscles to try to stabilize things. Now they end up with a straight spine, the cat does. Its paws facing downwards, eyes facing downwards, and can hit that ground and just take off from there. So really cool thing that they've been able to do. Unfortunately, Dr. Murray tried a number of other animals as well. It didn't work out quite so nicely. He tried a chicken in the air, was not able to right itself. Tried a rabbit, that didn't work too well either. Hope in research since then, we try to make sure that no animals get hurt in the experiments whenever possible. But that's a classic example of that conservation of angular momentum, in this case, even linear momentum. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is momentum, remember, is derived from Newton's second law, the law of acceleration. It's basically it's the quantity of motion an object has. So momentum is the product or the combination of the speed and the mass. The greater the velocity, the greater the momentum. The greater the mass, the greater the momentum. If both are high, then it can be really super high. So like a defensive back or linebacker making a tackle, they can generate a lot of impulse or a big change in momentum on the running back or quarterback getting ready for a dunk. It's a great example of generating a lot of impulse upward. Get ready for the big slam. Everybody's going to freak out. Hopefully we'll see that. This again come the winter and spring. Hopefully we get a vaccine and things calm down a bit. But impulse is the ability to change an object's momentum. Whether we're jumping, whether we're throwing, whether we're catching an object, changing momentum means we have to produce a force over a period of time. So recently when they were, SpaceX was launching the astronauts into space. So the first time Americans have gotten to the International Space Station without hitching a ride from the Russians over in Kazakhstan. Doesn't sound like a lot of fun, but it got used to get there for about 10 years. So anyway, the first time we blasted off with astronauts from Cape Canaveral in Florida, it got there fast, produced a really large impulse. Even in the Star Trek series, they'll talk about impulse power. And it simply means that product of force and mass. So for a rocket, we sometimes call the force the thrust, and then delta T is the burn time. So if we look at a formula for impulse, it looks something like this. The right hand of the equation is the change in momentum, so change in mass times velocity. To accomplish this, it takes a force exerted over a period of time. So for SpaceX, that rocket, it was burning, at least the initial stage, with a huge amount of thrust or force for a given period of time. It was about 70 to 90 seconds or so, wasn't maybe a couple minutes. And then that stage is released, actually went back towards the ground, and I think it landed on a barge or something like that, if I remember correctly. And then the second stage lights up and produces its own impulse. So the spacecraft got from 0 miles an hour to roughly close to 18,000 miles an hour. That's the speed needed to send or keep an object in orbit in just a few minutes. It didn't take very long. So the rocket was able to produce a huge amount of impulse. So here's Zion Williamson. He's been able to produce a lot of impulse. Volleyball player, another great example. So when you're changing momentum, or a high jumper or a long jumper, they also can produce a significant amount of impulse. So to maximize that, we have to figure out how we can increase the force. How can we maximize delta T if that's necessary to increase impulse? The greater the impulse for a given mass, the greater the change in velocity. So this is what golfers want to do. This is what a baseball player wants to do, or a softball player, or a tennis player wants to hit the ball really hard, wants to move that mass quickly, produce a lot of impulse. So it's going to take a large force, or delta T, or combination thereof. Where we have a very fast impact, like we do in baseball or tennis, where delta T is pretty short, that's why those forces we've seen have been super high. like 1.5 tons instead of like 3,500 pounds. Okay, so with impulse, we can either increase or decrease momentum. Doesn't really matter which one. And we're going to show you examples of both. So we were just talking about SpaceX. Here's SpaceX blasting off from Florida, and it's producing lots of impulse. The units for impulse, if you notice, are the product, the combination of force and time. For both the metric system, Newton seconds, and in the English system, pounds times seconds. So they are the left side of the equation. That's where the units come from. The right side's momentum, and so momentum, linear momentum, would be basically kilograms times meters per second. And for impulse, though, it's going to be Newton seconds. We use the left side of the equation. A high jumper is going to, by lowering their center of gravity, you get a significant amount of knee flexion at first between these two frames. Hip flexion, you're seeing that right there. That's stretching the muscles that are going to be using in hip extension, knee extension, also the gastrocnemius, the calf muscles that are used in plantar flexion, they're going to be stretched. That's going to initiate a stretch reflex, which will increase the force production. It also increases the number of cross bridges that line up when you have a muscle that is stretched. Thirdly, it actually puts these muscle joint systems, hip extension, knee extension, plantar flexion, at joint angles where they can produce more torque. The more torque you can produce at these joints, the greater the force between the foot and the ground. And then it also allows that person to go through a greater range of motion. If you try to jump and your knees and hips are already extended, you can't go through a very large range of motion because you've already reached pretty close to 180 degrees. So because of that, you wouldn't really see much of a jump. But here, we're able to maximize the force being produced, and we're able to increase the time over which that force is being produced by going through a larger range of motion. And this means in this jump, we're able to generate a significant amount of impulse, which is going to be able to carry this high jumper over the bar. So like I said, there are lots of examples of increasing as well as decreasing impulse. So let's say we're increasing an object's momentum. We can try to do things to maximize force or maximize delta T. For a discus and shot put, they can produce a lot of force, but they're also going to rotate 1.5 times and then throw the discus or the shot towards the target. And that rotation helps to increase delta T. So they're helping them maximize the amount of impulse they can produce. And that means either the discus or shot put's going to be able to go faster. So here you see someone winding up. This looks like it's going to be a big volleyball spike. They're really getting ready to produce lots of force. Delta T is going to be relatively small, but this jumping up is going to help a great deal. Okay, let me pause just a second. Okay, for a high jumper or someone going up for a rebound in basketball or spiking a volleyball, again, we've got that knee flexion, hip flexion. That's going to put them in really good position to produce lots of torque. And therefore, the amount of force between their foot and the ground is going to be high. And they're going to be able to launch themselves. Man, check that out. That person has just literally launched themselves like a rocket. And to do that, it took impulse. So when we measure impulse, we can use a force or pressure plate, and we can get a curve that'll look something like this. This actually looks like the curve for someone who's walking. But let's say someone's going to jump. You could get a curve, in theory, that might look something like this. So let's say we're comparing two individuals who are going to do the high jump. What we want to be able to do, whether it's high jump or volleyball or basketball, and we've got someone like Zion Williamson going up for a dunk or whatever, we want to be able to generate, in this case, as much upward momentum as possible. So the way we can do that is we can look for any given direction. We can look at the area under the curve. So what does that mean? Well, the area under the curve is this combination of force and delta T. If you remember your calculus, we could actually do is take the integral of force times dt, and that would give us this area under the curve. So this is an approximation of how much impulse is being produced, and therefore the change in momentum. The bigger the area, whether it's caused by an increase of force, increase in time, or combination thereof, that's going to produce more impulse. So let's say this is Amy versus Bethany, two individuals. Amy looks like, let's pretend they have the same mass. Let's assume they have the same mass. If that's true, then the area under this curve seems to indicate that Amy, in this case, could probably jump higher. So these would be something that performer, a coach, etc., will be looking at. You could also look at this in terms of someone recovering from an injury as well, and seeing how they're doing in their rehabilitation. So when you calculate this, force will always go in these graphs on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. If you do that, then the area under the curve is going to be the impulse, which will also be equal to the change in momentum. The bigger the curve, the greater the impulse, and therefore the greater the change in momentum. So we're going to look at actually a film produced by the National Science Foundation. This one's about football, and we're going to look at field goal kickers. Hopefully they'll do better than the Three Stooges. We're going to look at Hall of Famer Morton Anderson, who used to kick for New Orleans Saints and I believe Atlanta Hawks for a while. Wait a minute, Atlanta Falcons, and there was one of the birds. Hawks are the basketball team. Atlanta Falcons, a lot of field goals over the years. So we're going to take a look at this, and this takes into account impulse. So I'm looking at the foot placement here. This looks pretty good, right beside the ball. Maybe it's a little bit behind, but that puts the foot in a good place where it's maximizing its velocity as it's accelerating through the ball. Looks to me like Mo's a little bit behind. It's probably going to kick Curly in the head. Things could get ugly. We don't want to see that. So hang on a second. I'm going to move the screen over. Okay, here we go.
To be an NFL kicker takes more than just nerves of steel and a strong leg. It also requires help from one of the key laws of physics.
It's easy to say, well, I just kicked the ball. Well, let's delve into it. Let's look at the specifics. What actually happens when you kick the ball, and why does the ball go where you ask it to go? And it is Newton's second law of motion.
The second law is one of three laws described in 1687 by Sir Isaac Newton, who used them to describe how and why objects move.
So the second law says if you have an object with a mass that is accelerating, and acceleration means a change in velocity, that is equal to the amount of force applied to the object. The way we say it with words is F is equal to ma.
This also means that in order for an object like a football to accelerate, a force must be applied. To illustrate Newton's second law in kicking, we asked Morton Anderson, NFL's all-time scoring leader, to perform his craft in front of a high-speed phantom camera. The entire procedure unfolds in less than a second and a half, from snap to hold to kick.
It's all about training and rehearsing and doing something over and over and over again.
To reduce the chance of a block, NFL kickers take just 3 steps to the ball. The final step is with the plant foot, which provides the stable.
There we go. Perfect. So with a plant foot, it needs to be right next to that football. Why? So if you can imagine the foot working a bit like a pendulum, it's going to reach the bottom right around where the ball is. You want that foot to hit right under here so that it's got this upward blow and the foot is just starting to come up. So it's like a golf shot. You want to get down on the ball and let the loft of the club, in this case, the loft of the foot, move the ball upwards. And the reason you want to maximize that is that's where you can generate the greatest speed, either with a golf club or in this case, the person's foot. So they're going to use that kinematic chain. They're using impulse to get there. So even though they're 3 steps, they're producing a significant amount of force in a short period of time. When they hit the ball, another example of impulse, delta T is going to be pretty small. It's a little over one milliseconds, a couple milliseconds. Not as short as hitting a baseball, which is 7/110,000ths of a second, but actually fairly similar to hitting a tennis ball because that's 2 or 3 or 4 milliseconds.
Platform for the kick.
I call it the moment of truth. And the moment of truth is basically when your plant foot hits the ground next to the ball. You're either in the right position or the wrong position.
The kick itself involves the entire leg building the force necessary to launch the football.
Position.
Fortunately, I can't do
The kick
frame by
itself
frame. Let's see if I can
involves the
catch it.
entire leg built.
Just missed it.
Built.
Oh, got to work on my
Entire leg built.
Oh, it started the move. Almost got it.
The entire leg.
There we go. So you can see that foot right underneath. It's generating a vector up like that. That's where the football is going to go. Because the foot is right underneath the center of mass of the ball, and the vector is just underneath, the force vector that is, just underneath the center of the ball, that's going to generate torque because it's an off-center force, and you're going to see the football starts to flip with, I guess we call it backspin.
Building the force
There we go. You can
necessary
see
to
that
launch
backspin.
the football.
That's
It's a
actually going
hammer.
to generate
You're
some
swinging a
angular
hammer.
momentum
You're
to
trusting
keep it in the
and
air a little bit
it's
longer.
going to be, it's going to be impacting the ball with great velocity.
An NFL kicker's foot is in contact with the ball for just 8/1000ths of a second. And at that time, his foot applies up to a
Not
ton of
very long,
force
8
to the ball.
milliseconds.
This quick, violent strike is a perfect
So a
example
little
of
bit
what's
longer
known in
than
physics as an impulse.
contact between
Impulse
the
is
tennis
an
ball
important
and the
concept
strings.
because there is a
Okay. So I don't know if you noticed again, but both of our commentators here they're both professors. They're physics professors. They're really good ones, and you know this because they put them in the basement where if anything bad happens, nobody gets hurt. Lots of cool stuff. Looks like it's going on. This one's also football coach as well as a physics professor. Dr. Schmidt's at the University of Florida. The other professor is at the University of Maryland.
finite time over which the foot is in contact with the ball, and during that time there's a force applied to the football.
An impulse is equal to the force multiplied by the time the force is applied, represented by delta T. If force is graphed versus time, it's possible to see how a larger force or a longer time for the force supplies a bigger impulse.
Since impulse is really just the change in momentum, and since the
He's
ball,
got his prop. There you go. He's got his football. Again, University of Maryland, this professor is down in the basement. It's a really good physics professor.
doesn't change its mass, we're really just talking about the change in the speed. The bigger the impulse, the bigger the change in speed, which means the faster the ball is moving.
So he's exactly right. That's the key. The more impulse you can generate, whether you're hitting a baseball, tennis ball, kicking that football, etc., or hitting a golf ball or spiking a volleyball, the faster it's going to go.
After it leaves the kicker's foot.
And that means in terms of
Anderson
kicking,
says
you
the
go farther.
distance of the field goal
Kick
doesn't
that
change its
50, even
approach to the kick
60-yard
itself.
field goal.
Eventually, you want to look at a 50-plus yarder, like a 40-some yarder with some room to spare. I think that's a good way to kind of fool yourself into thinking it's a shorter kick.
Whether the kick is short or long, Newton's second law explains what an NFL kicker must do to send a football through the uprights.
Oops. Little impulse on the film there. Okay, hold on a second while I switch up. So one of the things to remember about impulse is it's a vector. So we're generating a force that's going to produce an acceleration and therefore impulse on the football. The impulse is going to have a vector. Let's say you want to kick it towards the uprights. So it's going to go in that particular direction. If you remember, if you've seen the film Apollo 13, so it's about the Apollo 13 astronauts in the early 1970s. They were supposed to go and land on the moon. They had some bad luck. An oxygen tank blew up on the way to the moon, and they had to actually use the lunar module to maintain power for the spacecraft. And they kind of hung on to it. They slingshot around the moon, and then they were trying to come back to Earth. They thought they had everything just right, but the vector wasn't quite right. So the problem is that when a spacecraft from the moon or Mars or wherever is coming back into the Earth's atmosphere, and even with low Earth orbit, you still have to do the same thing. You're just not moving at that kind of speed. You're moving at 18,000 miles an hour. These guys were moving at well over 24,000 miles an hour. So the problem is, if you come too steep, then the friction of the Earth's atmosphere burns the spacecraft up. If you come in too shallow, it bounces off the Earth's atmosphere like it would if it was a stone bouncing off the water. So you had to get the vector just right, not too shallow, not too steep. You had to get the velocity just right. So in that movie, and possibly in real life as well, they put the Earth in the window so that they could direct the force and get the right vector. So not just produce the right amount of force and the right amount of burn time, but in the right direction. So there's so many variables they had to kind of jury rig and figure out and tasked those early computers. So before NASA missions, computers were half the size of a room, for example. But they had to get miniature computers that were able to do these calculations and then send information back and forth between there and the Johnson Space Center. So it was really remarkable. Those NASA computers are the forerunners of today's microcomputers, including PCs and Macs, etc. So they were able to, with the computers, with all of these folks troubleshooting in the Johnson Space Center and the astronauts, they kind of had to figure it out because they had extra mass on board, because they had the lunar module as well as the spacecraft itself. And so they had to account for a different mass than they were used to. They had to figure out how much fuel they had to use, how much burn, how long it was, because how long the burn time was. Because remember, impulse is force times delta t. So they had to get both of these just right, the thrust and then the burn time. And then because it's a vector, they had to get the direction right. And so that was, why the Earth was, at least in the movie, in the window. So anyway, they figured it out, and it turned out they got it just right. In fact, it was so just right, they literally landed less than a mile away from the aircraft carrier that picked them up. It's unbelievable. I mean, the odds, because you're talking about as vector 100,000 miles from Earth, getting the force, the magnitude, getting the burn time, getting the direction just right, and landing within literally hundreds of yards from the aircraft carrier that ended up picking them out of the water. So it's almost as remarkable as landing on the moon. It's that amazing. So you probably know that many of those early astronauts through the Apollo missions and of course the Gemini and Mercury missions, many of those were fighter pilots. They were used to dealing with all kinds of stressors and used to improvising. And so a great example of improvising on the fly, math on the fly, physics on the fly, and getting it right. It's just unbelievable. Okay, well, sometimes we want to slow things down, catch them. So we can use impulse to do that, whether we're catching a softball or a baseball or tackling my dog who's wandered off. So impulse here is now we're trying to change momentum, but instead of causing that object to speed up, we're causing it to slow down. As far as the equation is concerned, it doesn't really matter. If we're speeding it up or slowing down, we still have to produce impulse. So to throw a 90 miles an hour fastball takes just as much impulse as catching it, and vice versa. So here's what gets interesting. When we catch an object and change its momentum, a lot of times we can figure out that momentum by calculating or figuring out delta V, the initial velocity versus the final velocity, which is often zero for catching a football or a baseball or a softball, etc., or landing in a pit after doing a pole vault. But then the left side of the equation gets to be interesting, because notice that these two, if the right side of this equation doesn't change, let's say every time you do a pole vault, you're going to land, you're going to probably land at with about the same speed, and you have the same mass. So the right side of this equation isn't going to change. Every time you catch a softball, right side of this equation doesn't change. For the softball, let's say it goes from 50, 60 miles an hour down to zero. The mass of the softball, that doesn't change. But the left side of the equation, we actually can manipulate, particularly this variable, that's delta t. That's the amount of time over which the impact occurs. So if I try to catch a softball or baseball, and I got my hand outstretched, no glove, it's going to be really painful, because I'm producing this huge impact force because delta t is low. So remember, hitting a baseball, you generate this huge force because delta t is low. If you catch something like a baseball that quickly, it's going to generate a massive force and break some bones and injure joints, etc. So this is a case where we want to actually increase delta t. So for a given momentum, if I can double delta t, I cut the force by 50%. If I quadruple delta t, then the force is 25% of what it normally would be. So this could be a really good thing. We actually have some words to describe this phenomenon. It's called cushioning. In engineering, we call it damping. What it means is that as you're deforming an object, and it could be a baseball or softball glove, it could be the pit, it could be a person's hands and gloves, and actually you can take into account the arms, because the arms can bring the ball in like that. And as they're moving, this whole system is deforming, it's changing its shape. As it changes its shape, it increases the contact time. So a pit is really good at increasing delta t. The soles of running shoes can do that as well. I'm going to have to take a shoe off. Usually I have some extras right here, but that's what the sole of a shoe is supposed to do. It deforms and changes its shape, and as it changes its shape, it increases delta t. So think about something like maybe silly putty or some soft clay. If an object collides with that soft clay, the soft clay deforms, changes the shape, increases delta t. The effect is a reduction in the amount of force. So sometimes people will mistakenly say you're absorbing force. No, you're reducing the force. It doesn't go anywhere. It's actually less because the impulse hasn't changed. That's what hasn't changed. But you've increased delta t. And so if the right side of this equation is a constant, meaning it doesn't change, and delta t goes up, force has to go down. If delta t goes down, then force has to go up. That's why when you hit a baseball or hit a golf ball, when delta t is super low, that's why those forces are ridiculously high, because you're generating a lot of impulse. In golf, you're hitting the ball like 180, even 190 miles an hour. I think Bryson DeChambeau last weekend hit a few that were like 196 on a drive, just ridiculous, almost 200 miles an hour. And hitting a home run in baseball, the ball has to be significantly over 100 miles an hour, 105, 110, I think 115, or maybe between 115 and 120 is the highest that anybody's actually measured, if I remember correctly. So if you hit it at 115 miles an hour, you can probably hit a 400 foot shot, perhaps. Okay, so we see this a lot of times in real life, cushioning, damping, whether it's gloves, shoe wear. The front end of an automobile in a crash is designed to crumple. It's actually called a crumple zone. So this is a way that we can actually protect ourselves. And also the way we catch something. If we catch a ball and again, bring it in like this, or a football, and change the shape of our arm and rotate the arm and move it, we can actually increase the time over which we're slowing down the object. That increases delta t, and therefore that reduces the impact. Just wearing the gloves increases delta t a little bit, and so that takes some of the burn out of it, so to speak. Okay, ooh, this looks ugly. This is on purpose, though, not the crash itself, but what happens to the car. So the car can fold up like an accordion. There's a crumple zone at both the back and the front of the car. So if there's an impact over a certain number of miles an hour, then the hood and the front fenders are literally going, this is going to be a time where there is bending, okay? That material is going to bend, it's going to crumple up, it's going to compress. And when it does that, it increases the time over which the impact occurs. And that, if that happens for a given change in momentum, then the impact force has to decrease. Also, automobiles, cars, trucks today, many of them are unibody, meaning that the load goes through the car continuously. So that way the load goes on the outside and protects as much as possible the passengers on the inside. There's still going to be forces, there's still going to be whiplash, but not as much of that initial impact force. We cushion or dampen that. It's they used to have a contest back in my engineering days, an egg drop contest, where you would go to the top of the old engineering building and you'd build a contraption that could actually cushion or dampen the impact and put an egg on the inside. And people who were successful at that, you'd have a contest, and then those that survived, which were few, or sometimes none. If you were the only one who survived, then you won automatically. If it were a tie, meaning that more than one person or group was able to do the egg drop without the egg breaking, then it went and looked at the design and looked at the effectiveness and uniqueness of the design and innovation of the design. And people came up with all kinds of crazy stuff in the egg drop contest. But that's the idea. We cushion or dampen, whether it's shoe wear, if we're wearing a shin splint, for example, shoulder pads, they're relatively effective. So it's about injury prevention, cushioning or damping. Now, the cool thing about running shoes is they have two properties which really help, and they can do both. They've got cushioning or damping, meaning they increase the initial collision by deforming themselves, but then they can bounce back. That actually can help in terms of kinetic energy when you push off. So having in a new shoe, and the good news and bad news for us is that over time these wear out, they lose some of the cushioning, they lose some of the elasticity, then you have to buy them again, which means they make more money, etc. But a new pair of shoes is going to have both cushioning and elasticity. And here we see, of course, some shin guards, and they're going to prevent if someone kicks you in the old shin and the tibia. They do two things. The cushioning here is going to dampen the blow, but the other thing it does is actually the hard padding spreads out the force over a larger contact area, and that reduces the pressure and stress on the tibia and the soft tissue, and that reduces the potential for injury. So again, we've got some circumstances where the shoe wearers can do two things at the same time, and so can the shin guard. So pretty amazing. Okay, so let's look at some runners, because there's been some debate over time, even though I don't think it's much of a debate anymore. When people walk, almost everybody's a heel striker. And that's okay, because you're only looking at 1.2, 1.4 times your body weight. If you're a bad walker, maybe 1.6 times your body weight. With running, it can be 2.5 to 3, even more than that. Athletes often have lower impact forces, but when you're running, if you land on your heel, you'll have a higher impact force, especially initially when the body can't really adjust for it. You're landing on the heel, you don't get to shorten the Achilles tendon, the gastrocnemius muscle. You don't stretch these muscles enough to produce more force. And also the direction of the force is down and forward. It means the reaction force is going to be up and backward. A lot of bad things about heel striking. So midfoot and even forefoot striking that goes immediately into a midfoot plant, those seem to be much better. They reduce that initial impact, and it looks like we can maximize the push-off force, especially in the horizontal direction, backwards. So let's take a look at a couple of, here's some heel strike. Oh, that looks bad. Oh, these, okay. Let me see if I can move this back. Oh, come on. Oh, there we go. Oh, that hurts just to look at that. So again, that impact force is going to be forward. That means the reaction force is going to be backward. You're landing on the heel. And immediately afterward, you're going to see the foot doing that. That is plantar flexion. That plantar flexion is going to shorten the Achilles. That means we can't stretch it. We can't stretch these muscles. That means it reduces the amount of calcium being released by the sarcoplastic reticulum. We don't have as much of a stretch reflex. And also, you don't get the maximal number of actin and myosin cross bridges available for those myosin heads. The more of these cross bridges we can form, myosin heads come in pairs, so that's why I got two of our tennis rackets. There you go, trying to line them up. So the more of these we can produce, the more cross bridges you can produce, the greater the amount of force, the greater the amount of shortening, and the greater the amount of torque. This isn't set up to produce good muscle shortening because we don't have good muscle lengthening beforehand. So that's why you have, for example, like a wind-up before a swing. That wind-up is going to increase the number of cross bridges available. When someone crouches down before they jump up, that stretching of those muscles is acting, and that stretching is going to increase the number of cross bridges, increase the force, maximize the number of motor units that are recruited and therefore muscle fibers. And also there's less of a chance of injury because you don't have as much of an impact force, especially at the heel. So that ankle is really going to feel it. The foot's going to come down funny as well. Let's see if, ooh, I'm almost, well, that's pretty good. Here we go. So notice what's been happening is you've got this plantar flexion. So that means instead of stretching the Achilles tendon, which can store a significant amount of energy, it's shortening. And the arch of the foot, right? It's not, you're not stretching the plantar fascia, the calcaneonavicular ligament, because you're landing on that heel. You have an arch for a reason. It's been around at least 1.2 million years. It's there for more than one reason. Support, it's really good at that, as also can store significant amount of strain force and strain energy. So you can't do that when you land on your heel if you're running. Walking is not that big a deal. Oh, there it is again. Oh my goodness. Yes, I agree, Trixie, this is scary. Let me go back again. Oh, just about landing. Oh, that gastrocnemius is in for some trouble. Oh, there's that initial impact. One of the things to notice, let's go back again. You do get that contraction of the muscle just before it lands, that spinal tuning that we talked about before. Oh, check it, turn on. Let's do this again. Oh, it's really contracting here. And it needs to. That's a big jarring effect. And we're not even over the arch of the foot yet. Let's see. only now will the Achilles tendon start to stretch, because we're getting now dorsiflexion at the ankle, but we've lost a lot. That makes the push off much more difficult. You're not going to get as much bang for your buck. So there we go. And landing on your heel, you gets that ankle. So here's some midfoot striking. Not bad. Let's go back a bit. Looks like we're just starting to make impact. We've got the ankle closer to being underneath the knee. That's actually pretty good. We can't see up here, but there should be significantly more knee flexion than we saw with rear foot striking. So because we're landing and getting that arch of the foot into the action almost immediately, it's able to support the body. It's going to produce a lower initial impact force. We're going to start stretching the plantar fascia, calcaneonavicular ligament. You get an earlier stretch of the Achilles tendon, the gastrocnemius and soleus muscles, even the quadriceps muscles get into the action. And if that looks like, oh, that's a smoother gait, indeed, your eyes are not fooling you. So I think we got forefoot locomotion, just a second, of forefoot landing. Back just a hair. Let me go to the next step. Oh, that's the landing. Perfect. So here we can see that ankle right underneath the knee joint. That's really good. Let me see if we can get this again. Oh, they're going to barely touch that forefoot and go right into a plant underneath the arch of the foot. That's already starting to stretch the plantar fascia. And now we're starting to activate the Achilles tendon and starting to stretch the gastrocnemius right away. So there's a lot of argument today for just barely landing on the ball of your foot and going immediately into that foot plant. So that type of landing is going to increase delta T. That is going to reduce that initial impact force. But then when they're pushing off, they can often actually produce a greater amount of force and a greater amount of impulse. So that's basically having your cake and eating it too, reducing that initial impact force, maximizing the push-off force. That person is going to run faster. And oh my goodness, what the thing I need to emphasize, when they land, that initial force is going to be virtually straight down. So that means that that reaction force, if we resolve it, that X component is going to be pretty much disappeared. There's not going to be that big backward component slowing that person down, increasing the amount of energy that they have to use while they're trying to run at a certain velocity. So well done. Okay, let's go to the next slide then. If I can. And I think we're going to take a look at that ultra marathon runner, our Kenyan runner. And I think we're just going to run and take a look at how smooth he is. And he doesn't go up and down a little bit. We can go slow motion, check that out. And then let's get the landing. Oh, what is that? What was that? Oh, they're switching. Oh, let me run. Just about there, you can see there's barely some room underneath. Oh, look at that knee flexion. And look at the swing phase. Oh, perfect. I think the eagle has landed, and perfect mechanics. Look at that knee flexion, and they're hitting underneath the arch of the foot. That arch is going to compress, stretch the plantar fascia, calcaneum, the navicular ligament, early stretch of that Achilles tendon, the gastrocnemius and soleus muscles, the quadriceps muscles. Let's look at the push off too. Oh, he's still pushing off. He should get a lot of hip hyperextension. And this is the time that the knee should be extended. Not when you land. It's got to be flexed when you land, but when you're pushing off. Oh, yeah, check that out. You can see the toes still on the ground. Maximize it. That's how you get a long stride length. Right there. That push off. And he's doing it pretty quick too. Oh, he's still, toes still on the ground. Knees almost perfectly extended. Huge hyperextension. I think we're just taking off. Amazing. Okay, so to kind of review, and this is from the journal article that I picked up. This is a ground reaction force. This is just a vertical component, not the total component, but just the vertical component for a heel striker. Oh, again, that hurts. Look at that vector down. That means the reaction vector is going to be up and backwards. Very large force, well over twice your body weight. So you could be looking at 300, 400 pounds plus a body weight, and then this sharp rise to probably 500 pounds. Your feet and your ankle and your knee, man, they've got a lot to deal with. So look at this big spike early on. For the mid or forefoot striker, it almost disappears. Also, people who are heel strikers also pronate often, and that means their foot does that, and it kind of points out. That's going to put a lot of twisting force or torsion. They're going to have a significant amount of shear force at the foot and ankle as well. So that's one of the reasons why heel strikers who are runners, almost everybody is who's a walker, but who are runners are often more susceptible to injuries. And they often have what is called a waffle shoe design with a wide back to be able to deal with those large forces and spread them out. So that initial impact force, that can be an issue. So that's something we try to get rid of with the runners. And if we can land with that knee flexed in a better flexed position and then push off better, that's going to allow that person to be a more efficient runner using less energy, but at the same time running faster, which is exactly what they all want. Okay, another big problem. We're coming towards the fall. Maybe we'll have football season. We don't know. But one of the big problems, as you guys know, over decades, but it's been a big topic, especially over the last 10 to 12 years or so, has been the huge impact you have when helmets collide. It's like whacking a cue ball and having it hit that 8 ball. And because you have these helmets are made of Kevlar. In fact, you can see them deforming right here. Oh my goodness. So they must be generating a huge force. They both have a lot of momentum, a lot of mass. They're moving quickly. Big change in momentum. The problem is with the collision, when you have two really stiff materials that are going to hit each other. So, good example is going to be the old golf ball and golf club. When they collide with each other, we're looking at just a few 10,000ths of a second. I think it's pretty close to what we see for baseball. 0.0007 or 0.008 seconds, really super short. And if delta T is really small, because you're taking two hard, stiff materials that are also elastic, they're going to bounce off of each other. Huge change in velocity, small delta T. When the right side of this equation is super large, and the delta T is super small, that means the impact force is going to be mammoth. It's gigantic. And the problem is that the brain inside their head is going to be, I don't have an egg here, maybe I could go get one, is going to be like the yolk inside an egg. As that egg moves and stops very quickly, then the yolk hits one side of the eggshell and hits the other side of the eggshell with that whiplash. And that, unfortunately, is what happens, is that the inertia of the brain carries it forward, to the skull on one side, then it whiplashes back and hits the other side. So that's what causes the damage. Even if you don't have a concussion, as you heard, if you have a lot of those collisions, even without a concussion, it's likely to cause more long-term brain damage. So the problem here is a lack of cushioning, a lack of damping. Can we do something about it? If we can double or triple delta T, that's a huge reduction of force on our heads and brains. Boy, that would be a lot better. So you've probably seen these helmets. You'll sometimes see, and at the NFL level and college level, them wearing them in practice, and oftentimes with youth football and games, you can see a lot more padding on the outside. So what this is going to do is when helmets collide today, and as you know, it's a penalty if you have head-to-head contact. So they've changed some of the rules, added in some penalties, and they can also throw out a person who's either done it deliberately, or sometimes it doesn't even have to be a deliberate action for that person to be thrown out. When those two helmets collide, because you have the padding on the outside now, initially it didn't look quite as cool, but now we're getting used to it, and I think it actually looks kind of cool to me. So we'll see, but I think what's going to have to happen over the next decade is there's going to have to be a change of the design of the helmets that they use during games. We're still working it out, because sometimes if the helmets slide and hit a more tangential shot off of each other, where you have some shear and then maybe some sticking, it could potentially cause neck damage. So cervical damage. So they're trying to find helmets that will work ideally, but these are a pretty good start, because they're going to increase dramatically delta T, given a significant change in momentum. And that, of course, is going to result in a reduction in the impact force because of the increased delta T. So anything we can do to cushion the blow, literally, the better off we'll be. Okay, so we'll do, I think, a quick problem and then talk about the law of action and reaction to finish things up. So Sam's a rear foot striker with a mass of 70 kilograms. If they're running at 6 meters per second, the foot approaches the ground at a velocity of 4 meters per second. They're going to run with an old pair of shoes, shoe A, versus a new pair of shoes. So the new pair of shoes should have more cushioning. Its delta T has been calculated at this type of impact to be significantly longer, 0.110 seconds, as opposed to 85 milliseconds. Let's find the impact force for each. Here's the change in velocity. Here's the mass of the individual. What's different is delta T. So we're going to set up, using our formula, the impulse equation. In this case, we're going to be isolating the impact force. So we're going to divide both sides by delta T. And when we do that, the initial impact force in the old pair of shoes, you can see, is pretty large, 3294.1 newtons. And then the new pair of shoes, it's 70 times, and we'll use this as a negative sign, meaning downward, minus 4 meters per second divided by 0.110 seconds. With the extra cushioning, we've caused a significant reduction, about a little over 25% reduction in the impact force. So shoe cushioning, it does work. It's not a mistake. Okay, finally, Newton's third law, the law of action reaction. I think this is one people understand better, because it makes sense. A lot of things in life, you push on something, it pushes back. When one body exerts a force on another, the second body exerts a reaction force that is equal in magnitude and opposite in direction. So when hitting a tennis ball with this backhand shot, the racket's going to, the ball is going to, and when it collides with the racket, it's going to produce a force in one direction. The racket strings are going to produce a force in the opposite direction, propelling the tennis ball forward. When someone is swimming, like freestyle or breaststroke or butterfly, which hurts a lot more, and you push with your arms backwards, you're pushing water molecules behind you. The faster you can push those water molecules behind you, the greater the reaction force. So the harder you push, the faster you're going to go forward. Lots of examples of this. In pool, we see this a lot. If you get in a swivel chair and you rotate in one direction, your bottom half of your body is going to rotate in the other direction. If you push on a wall, the wall is going to push back. In a collision, there's lots of things that happen. Batting the ball, the bat will be slowed down quite a bit, maybe even knocked back as the ball goes forward. So lots of examples of this. With football, you push on someone, they push back. You can generate huge amounts of reaction force. The one we deal with the most is really ground reaction forces. Here's Maurice Green finishing up. I think he's just won the gold medal in the 2000 Olympic Games, so 20 years ago now. Here's the action force, and here's the reaction force. I think this is just after the finish line, so the reaction force is a little bit backwards. That means it's going to slow him down a little bit, which is fine because the race is over. He's won his gold medal. When we walk, we see a reaction force that looks something like this. Again, with a force time graph, we're going to look something like that. This is the impulse. This is the impulse itself. So this is a little over someone's body weight. Looks like it's about 730 or 40 newtons. Seems like about 1.2 to 1.4 times someone's body weight. That seems about right for walking. This is your landing, and then this is the push off. This is the vertical portion of the force. This is the horizontal. If we added these together, you'd actually get a bigger hump with the heel strike, and most people, when they walk, they are heel strikers. Ground reaction forces are what we deal with the most, or one of the forces that we deal with the most. And as we were discussing before, when someone lands with that knee extended, you want the knee extended when you push off, right? Not when you land, when you're running. And so that action force is going to be down and forward. That reaction force is up and backward. So there's going to be a significant X component pointing backwards, slowing that person down. Here we see someone looks like they're a nice midfoot striker. Notice how the ankle is right underneath the knee joint. Really good mechanics. They're going to lose this initial hump. You want to get rid of that thing. So, because we're talking about huge amounts of forces, 300, 400, 500, 600 pounds or more of impact force. So this is where shoe cushioning comes in. This is where your mechanics come in. We've noticed and we've tested in our laboratories when it could be an endurance runner or even a sprinter, when we get these really well-trained athletes, and some of them are were just natural athletes, when they run, because that vertical component is actually lower, they actually produce a lower impact force than someone who's maybe a novice or someone like myself who's running at about the same pace. It's pretty amazing. You would think they'd have a higher impact force, but it's actually lower because that Y component's lower. But what's usually a little larger is that horizontal component, especially when they're pushing off that portion of the curve, this portion right here. This is larger in those runners, but the vertical component is actually smaller. So pretty cool. So this is what we want to avoid, that initial lower impact force. We want to maximize, because we have springs in our lower extremities, but we also pendulum motion. When the leg swings forward, especially with walking, it acts like a pendulum. But that's true even when running. We just have a pendulum frequency that's shorter because we have more knee flexion, and that means we bring more mass closer to the axis of rotation. We also get a reverse pivot or a reverse pendulum during foot plant. And that's another energy saving device. So we got lots of energy saving devices. We've got springs in the lower extremities. We have a pendulum when the leg is swinging. We also have what's called a reverse pendulum or reverse pivot when you land. So your body acts like a pendulum and goes over that foot. This center of gravity isn't quite right. It's actually a little flatter than this. And the reason being is when you land, the length of the leg actually doesn't increase. If you look at this person here, they've drawn a longer leg. This leg looks shorter. It's not. What's happened is you get more knee flexion, but because the foot, it looks like it's ahead of the center of gravity. And this will happen when you land. Your ankle shouldn't be ahead of your knee, but your foot and ankle should be ahead of your center of gravity. So here's this person's center of gravity or normal center of mass. Here's the foot. It's in front of it. It's supposed to be in front of it. Not this far in front of it, but it should be in front of it. And so that means that as the knee flexes, because now the foot is underneath the center of gravity, that center of gravity is going to stay pretty steady. When we looked at Scott Demery, and I'm going to find a clip and show that to you when he's running on the treadmill, man, his center of gravity just stays just like that. It doesn't go up and down. So I'm going to find some clips, maybe make some AVIs from them. I'll find them and show them to you. Well, I can probably do that at the end of lecture today if I can do that really, really quickly. Okay, so here's what we don't want to have happen. This is from the Susan Hall text, which is actually the best-selling text in biomechanics. I don't know if she did this on purpose or not. I can say, and whether this was intended or not, see the frown on this guy? He should have a frown. I think he's running faster here because the air is being blown back. I think this was probably drawn in the 1980s, so he'd be here. But here's again the problem. The knee's almost straight, very little flexion when he hits. He should land on his heel. The fact that he hasn't done that and he lands with the foot plantar flex like this, that's a high ankle sprain, because there's no way you can do this without spraining the joint between the tibia and the talus bone. And that's what when people talk about a high ankle sprain, that's what they mean. A low ankle sprain will be at the subtalar level, between the talus and the calcaneus, around where you have ligaments that go from the calcaneus and the lateral malleolus onto the foot. So that's what sometimes people call the low ankle sprain, but technically that's the subtalar joint. So here's the bottom line. When we resolve this reaction force vector, this is why he's frowning. Oh man, check that out. This reaction force, the x component is pointing backwards, especially here. So maybe that frown's because all the pain he's in. It looks like a lot of pain to me. Okay, so very quickly, we're going to review some terms that we talked about before when we're looking at efficiency, but because we're talking about Newton's laws, especially the second law of motion, that leads us into, now that we've talked about force, into things like work. So work's the ability of a force to be able to move an object, whether we're lifting it, overcoming friction, whether we're causing something to roll, like the wheels on a bicycle or a cycle ergometer, climbing a set of stairs, etc., lifting a weight, military press. All of these things produce mechanical work. It's the combination or product of the force being exerted and how far we've moved it. Quantifying can get a little tricky. The math can get a little tricky unless you keep things simple, like the force, the friction that's due to a flywheel on a cycle ergometer, or vertical distance that you've lifted. If you move something at an angle or horizontally, it is possible to calculate it, but it's a bit tricky. It's not as straightforward as some folks think. But nonetheless, it's possible to do. It's even possible to calculate work due to frictional forces, et cetera, and moving your mass forward. So there are mechanisms to be able to, and some mathematics to be able to account for that. But anyway, it's the product of the force and distance. So force would be in newtons, distance would be in meters. We, in terms of units for work, we're going to use joules. So a joule is basically 1 Newton of force moved 1 meter. And in the English system, well, it's just foot-pounds. So if we're, let's say, doing some mechanical work like a military press, if we take a 200 Newton weight, we lift it a vertical height of 0.5 meters. That's easy to calculate when you have something move a vertical height. That's usually what we do when we lift the weight. We'll just calculate the vertical height lifted and multiply by the weight, or if there's an impact force, etc. We'll take that into account. So here we got 200 newtons of weight multiplied by half a meter. That's 100 joules of mechanical work. So if we produce work fast, that's power. Sometimes it's called work rate. Work rate means the ability to produce that power fast. So well, there's Zion Williamson again. And he's his head's at rim level, his eyes are rim level, getting ready to dunk it. So with power, we're producing work fast. So it's work divided by how long it took you to produce that work. We can take work and, of course, derive that as force times the distance moved. It can be vertical or not. Distance divided by time is velocity. So, oh yeah, we got now force times velocity, a little derivation. This is going to help us go a long way because most people conceptually can't think of work very well because you have to calculate it. And then when someone's doing something like, we say like force, well, work is, well, you know, if you're sweating, you're producing a lot of work. You certainly feel it. But it's a lot harder to, it's easier to capture and calculate and to measure things like force and velocity. And conceptually, it helps us well because it's a combination of strength and speed. So people who do true power events can produce a lot of force and can move quickly. So Zion's an example, shot put. To me, the ultimate power athlete is the shot putter. Olympic lifting, these are power lifts. Power lifts are not power lifts. The deadlift and especially the bench press, when you're talking about maximal lifts, are not power lifts. Because what you're doing is you're generating, yeah, a lot of force, but to do a maximal lift, you don't do it very fast. So if the velocity is low and the force is very high, you end up actually with low power. When you have a pretty large force and you're doing it really quickly, that combination is going to give you that maximal power. So the person named power lifts did not pass biomechanics. They are not power events. They are feats of strength. This is a power event, the clean and jerk. This is a classic one. The shot put, hurdles, sprinting, high jumpers, long jumpers, running backs, they're the power athletes. These are the power athletes. So when people are training for power, they're going to try to maximize their strength and maximize their movement speed. Some of that can be done through better mechanics. Some of that can be done through plyometrics. There are other exercises that can make the movement faster. We can't increase the percentage of fast twitch fibers. The other thing you can do is pick your parents wisely and pick parents that have a high percentage of fast twitch fibers if you want to produce tons of force. So there's not much going on TV as far as sports are concerned, except for golf. So Bryson DeChambeau has become kind of the person of the day because he was a physics major at SMU, and now he's using science and physics to revolutionize sports almost the same way in a sense that Tiger Woods did. Tiger Woods had a ton of talent, but he worked on his skills, he worked on his strength, he worked on his power. So Brian DeChambeau knows that the way to win at golf, especially if your short game isn't great yet, is to hit drives long and straight. So that way on par fours, you have driver wedge. On the par fives, you can reach the green in two. And then even if you two putt, hey, you've still made a birdie. So that meant, in fact, Bryson DeChambeau now, I think, is #1 in birdies made in the USGA or the PGA, I guess the PGA, in the PGA Tour. So his reasoning was, well, golf, you actually need some power, especially on a drive. So if I can work out mechanics, the other thing he's done is he's got funky looking foot movement, at least for people who play golf a long time. And that's because he's done a very smart thing. He takes his lead foot and he allows, excuse me, I have to take a shoe off. He allows his foot to move forward like that. Why does he do that? Because that's going to take a lot of torque and torsion off of his knee and off of his spine. That's why Tiger Woods has had so many operations on his knee and on his spine, because of the tremendous torque put on his left foot, because he keeps that left foot completely planted. The old school reasoning was, if you keep it planted, it'll be easier to hit the ball straight. Yes and no. If you notice in baseball or other sports, people can kind of hit it, kick it straight, and move their feet at the same time. In fact, point them towards the target. So I don't actually think it's a bad thing. Well, coming back to power. So what did he do? He gained a lot of muscle mass, muscle weight, 20 pounds, I think, in late 2019. And then during this COVID crisis, he gained another 20 pounds. Well, that maximizes the force. He also did some exercises that tried to improve the speed, the velocity. So with that extra power, it means that the club head speed increased from about 120 miles an hour to about 130 plus miles an hour. Think about 132 to 135. So now he's averaging 350, 355 yards off the tee in these par fours and par fives. And he uses a pretty long driver as well. I'm trying to remember the 45-inch driver. I think he uses, a pretty long driver as well. And that's an advantage if you can control it, because that increases the radius of the circle when he's swinging. And if you can increase the radius, it means that you're going to increase the arc length. And if you increase the arc length for a given amount of time, that increases club head speed. Because to hit a golf ball far or hit a tennis ball 130, 135, 140 miles an hour, to hit a baseball far, or to kick a 55-yard field goal, it's all about foot speed, bat speed, racket speed, club head speed, the need for speed, especially when you're colliding with an object with low mass. That's what gets it out there. And that allows that through impulse, you get that huge change in velocity. That's where you get that 110 mile an hour home run. That's where you get that monster 350-yard drive, because now you're producing a ball velocity of 190 miles an hour plus, even close to 200 miles an hour. So that's what does it. These are your power athletes. Discus player. And who would have thought golfers would be power athletes? But now the game is changing. Now it's become not a game, it's become basically more of an athletic event. So maybe people who are thinking, I could collide my helmet, my head, with another person and their helmet a lot and not be able to remember people's names and in the few decades, or I could go out and play golf where the ball stays still and no one tries to tackle me while I'm making a shot. Even though I've always thought it would be kind of cool to combine golf and tackling, but it's probably not going to happen. But nonetheless, those are some of your power athletes. These are your power athletes. Here's a long jumper, volleyball player. That's a power athlete. Someone who does a maximal bench press is not a power athlete. Unless they're using their bench press to increase the force they can produce, and then they still have to produce the movement fast. Here's your discus thrower. Again, your power athletes, the real deal. Okay, a quick, easy problem. let's say that we produced 100 joules of work, and it takes 2 seconds to do that. Well, that's 50 watts of power. But let's say that I'm just feeling really powerful. And that's actually a fairly lightweight 200 newtons. So I do like that. So instead of 2 seconds, it takes me 0.2 seconds. So if I divide that 100 joules of work divided by 0.2, then I've got 500 watts. That's a fair amount of power. Just to let you know, VO2 max for most of you folks is going to be about 200 watts, maybe 250. We've measured during Olympic lifting here at A&M with actually a couple of the strength and conditioning coaches, a couple of them that are still there. They're able to produce 2,000, 3,000 watts, huge amounts of power. That's with Olympic lifting. So a lot of times football teams, in fact, back in the day, the wrecking crew at A&M, they used to do a lot of these Olympic lifts, and maybe we're going to be going back to them, but that meant these were true power athletes on defense. That meant they were fast and strong, and that combination, that's the kind of thing that your running back and wide receiver are going to be frightened of. Okay, so that does it for power as well as Newton's laws, and we'll see you next time. I'm going to dig up those films of Scott Demery and a couple of other people just to show you. Okay, have a good one. We will see you soon.